Hello and welcome to Movers and Shakers. I'm Ken Miller. Today I'm joined by State Representative Dave Buehler. Dave, thank you very much for coming in today.
Good to be here.
The 2023 Kansas Legislative regular session ended about a month ago, and the veto session concluded at the end of the month. So from your perspective, now that it's all said and done, what is the most consequential action state lawmakers took this year?
Okay, it's a good question, and I've thought about that. I thought about it in terms of my newsletter and other things, but there were several things that came to mind, and I think we may get into some of these. One of them was the tax bill that we worked on. Second one would have been the education bill that the governor just recently signed. Third one would have been the fact that in this session, the legislature had a record, according to Speaker Hawkins, the number of veto overrides, of Governor Kelly's overrides. And so I could probably talk about any of those three things, but honestly, when it comes close to home, the one thing that I think is consequential for this community is we passed a bill, Senate Bill 174, and that is decriminalization of fentanyl test strips. I think everybody in this community knows, or a lot of folks in this community knows, that we lost a young man from Lansing High School this year due to fentanyl poisoning. And this law, this is actually the third time that it was in front of the legislator. What changed was that the peace officers associations up until this point were actually opponents of the bill. And their perspective was, if you go back and look at either, or talk to them or look at some of their testimony, the thought was if you decriminalize fentanyl test strips, we could potentially have an unintended consequence. In other words, people would be more tended or prone to using drugs, fentanyl, etc. Given the alarming rise in fentanyl poisoning, deaths to Americans due to fentanyl, this was a bill that again came before the House, came Health and Human Services Committee, which I serve on, and it passed both the House and the Senate, and the governor passed it. To me, that is a consequential bill that's timely for where we are today.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, we'll start with the budget, because that's what you mentioned up front. What's your take on proposed spending and programs? And we're going to separate out discussion on the proposed tax cuts, or the tax cuts in the next question, but let's start with the budget.
Okay. So I did bring, for illustrative purposes only, this is the myriad of pages that the legislators received relative to the 2024 budget. There's a couple of things of significance. Number one, in this stack, there are over 200 different segments or places where the state spends money. So it's a very complicated process. But if you want to pack it down into what does it mean to us, the state general fund will increase, or will be right at $10.2 billion for fiscal year 24, up a little bit from the previous year. It's about a 1.1% increase. There's 3 or 4 large buckets of spending. Education is usually 60 to 62%, and that again happened this year. Human services, I think 26%, and then government, public safety are about 5 or 6% each. So really the two big buckets are on human services and education. And so that's the spending process. But what I would tell you is, and this is what I learned as a first-term legislator. In fact, Representative Henry Helgerson, he's a Democrat from Wichita, sits right in front of me on the House floor. Henry is, I'm going to say, fiscally moderate, and he lectured the House on numerous occasions about the budget process for the state. While the governor prepares her budget in November, the House and Senate don't start working on it until January when session convenes.
Right.
And then they have 3 months to synthesize this 200 pages of stuff to come to a workable budget that we passed on the last night of the session. Henry would tell you, Henry Hubbardson, if he was there, this process is broken. And what he meant by that, and what I've come to believe, is you don't have a lot of time to go through and dig into each of these line item numbers. And they're spending everywhere. I mentioned 200 segments, I think, at least. On a budget of $10.2 billion, you would think we could have a little more time, oversight, and thoughtfulness. Apparently, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was done a little differently. It may not have been any better, but it sure feels like this becomes a rushed item. It's one of the last two things the budget and the education bill, and that's what happened this year. So
Was it a little strange to you, and I know this was your first session, right? So you only know about studying these numbers, given that it probably wasn't enough time, like you just said, but you guys were working with a surplus. And really up until a couple of years ago, that hadn't been seen in a very long time. So you're more than, I hope this isn't true, but you're more than likely in a couple of years to be going back to where you're really squeezing for every dollar. At this point, you were dealing with kind of a good problem to have, which was there's a ton of money in the budget. How do we partition that?
Yeah, and when we get into, if we get a chance to talk about tax, we'll talk about the rainy day fund. I would say one more thing on the budget, you know, when to bring it home and locally. Part of what went into this year's budget was pay for government, state of Kansas employees, government employees. And the good news, and I'll speak to Department of Corrections, the Department of Corrections staff is slated to get a 5% increase in pay this coming year. And then in addition to that, there's a proviso in there, there's language in the bill that talks about adjustments based on market conditions going forward. There's still a lot of room needed for growth for the Department of Corrections employees, but it's a good news story of what came out of this. And to your point, it's easier to do that when there is surplus, so to speak.
Right. Okay, let's go and get into the tax cuts now, because with a surplus, I think that probably hopped up the discussion about how the legislature, with the governor or without the governor, can potentially pass on savings to those of us who feed the till.
So I would say this was the high and the low for me when it comes to this legislative session. Again, I sat on the tax committee, and if you look at the activity in January, February, and March, it was very much you know, people might call them carve-outs. It was nothing comprehensive. There were a onesie-twosie. There was a film tax credit was one. I mean, they seemed to come out of the woodwork.
Right.
But towards the middle end of March, we started working in the tax committee on a bipartisan plan, which became known as House Substitute for Senate Bill 169 or Conference Committee Report 169. That's the bill. So that was the high and the low. The low part was the governor vetoed it. But what I'd like to do is there's I think 6 elements, and I may have to make sure I get them correct and in the right order. The first one was, and again, this was negotiated with Tom Sawyer, who was the ranking Democrat on this committee. Henry Helgerson, as I mentioned before, was on the committee. Bipartisan group. We took a look at that surplus that you mentioned, and Chairman Smith had worked with the Senate and said, look, we think this state can sustain a $500 million in tax cuts. And that was the threshold that we looked at. And then the question becomes, what can we do to create a package that will benefit all Kansas, at least in some way? So with those being the guardrails, one piece was a single tax rate. The agreement between the House and Senate was 5.25%. We raised the income tax deductions levels for single filers and married filing jointly. We increased the threshold on Social Security taxes from, I think it was $75,000 to $125,000. It's the cliff that's part of our tax system. There was an increase in the residential property tax exemption, value of the home, and the last part of it was we lowered the corporate and banking privilege taxes. So there were 6 elements to it. And they were designed to give Kansans tax relief, sustainable tax relief, put money, and yet still put money into the rainy day fund and make it sustainable.
Right.
Okay, so that went back and forth between the House and the Senate. Both the House and the Senate passed it. The governor vetoed it. It came back into the House, and the House was able to override her veto with enough votes. It failed in the Senate by 1 vote. So again, I go back to the highs and lows. This was truly a bipartisan bill. It was something I felt very good about working on. It's something we could come back to voters and say, look, we've delivered to Kansas. It doesn't solve all of the problems, but at least gives us a place to start from. I am hopeful for next year, though, for a couple of reasons. Number one, because we didn't enact any major tax legislation, the rainy day fund went from 1.6, actually, because the state's taken in more revenue than
Right.
the consensus revenue estimates have gone up. The year-end projection for this year is 1.8 billion. We're going to add another 0.8 billion, so that when we have a rainy day funds for 2024, it's going to be 2.6 billion dollars.
Right. A record.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
and certainly, and I think all sides agree, that's Kansas taxpayers' money, and we need to provide some of that back to them. The second part, and I don't want this to sound cynical at all, but next year is an election year.
Right.
Those who voted no for this type of legislation this year might very well be inclined next year to vote the other way.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the highs and the lows for me.
Sure. No, I understand. All right, we'll get away from the numbers a little bit here, at least the budgetary numbers. A couple of other issues that took center stage, at least according to the media, in the 2023 Kansas session. Transgender Sports Ban. It made a lot of headlines during the session, and not only in Kansas, but in other states as well.
Yeah.
Explain the path that issue took and where it ended up in Kansas.
Okay, so if memory serves me correct, that's House Bill 2238, and the short version that we would call it was the Women in Sports Bill. And you're right, it's an emotional issue, and like other bills, this had been before the legislature before it passed, and there weren't enough votes to override the governor's veto. So the bill itself came early in the House. I think it was in February. We had both proponent and opponent testimony. I think the most notable one who came to speak not only to the Republican caucus, but came to speak to the Health and Human Services Committee was Riley Gaines. Riley, as many people know, is a former All-American swimmer at the University of Kentucky, and she was defeated in the NCAA championships a year ago by Leah Thomas, a transgender or biological male competing as a female. Riley was probably the centerpiece of proponent testimony when it came to, hey, Title IX existed, goes back to 71 or 72, to create level playing fields for females in sporting activities. And what the bill essentially says is that your biological sex determines, and again, biological sex, not what gender you appear to be to favor.
It's how you were born.
Right, it's how you're born.
Right.
Biological, male or female.
Right.
You will compete in that sport, middle school and high school, and that's the direction that's given to KSHA, the Kansas State High School Athletic Association. That was an emotional vote.
Sure.
Emotional in committee, emotional testimony on both sides. I think one note there, we have a Democrat from Wyandotte County, Marvin Robinson, who voted with mostly the Republican side to override the governor's veto. I talked to Marvin after the vote, and he made a comment, and it was something along these lines. He said, I have sisters, and they have daughters or something to that effect, who play sports. How can I look them in the eye and tell them it's okay for a biological male to compete against them?
Right.
And so really, this isn't a bill to reduce or eliminate or dehumanize folks who identify as transgender. This is about fairness in women's sports, and that's the reason that it passed. And I would tell you, and I have received, as you can imagine, I have received comments from both sides of the equation, but by and far, most of the voters I've heard from are for the way we passed that bill.
And to me, I heard both sides and followed it in the media, and I read somewhere, and again, when you read something, doesn't mean necessarily that it's truth, but there was and I want to say it was on the high school level, where there was a survey taken, or there were statistics compiled that said in the state of Kansas you had 3 transgender athletes.
Right.
So it's not an everyday occurrence in every school district, but it's there.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. We could probably talk about the transgender issue a lot, and I don't want to belabor the point or diminish the point either. But because it's not here today doesn't mean it's not going to be next week.
Right.
You can look all across this nation and see examples of it everywhere. And so this was an example, I think, of the legislature being proactive and doing the right thing.
Yeah. Okay, all right, let's move on to Medicaid and medical marijuana. Where do these issues stand currently, and what, if anything, transpired in this session? So we'll start with Medicaid.
Okay. Well, the answer to both is about the same.
Right.
So Medicaid came up in the Health and Human Service Committee, didn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the challenge, the discussion gets very charged. It gets very emotional. It gets very charged. But if you look at the Republican platform, the party and the caucus, the position basically is this. And I can't recall all the states off the top of my head, but I know last fall when I was running for office, I had dug into this fairly well. Most, if in fact all states who have implemented some sort of Medicaid expansion find two things to be true. Number one, the number of enrollees that whoever the office is that estimates it is grossly understated. And number two, the cost to maintain the program is grossly understated. And so in other words, you have, and I'm not talking by 1,000 or 2,000, by order of magnitude 40, 50 to 100% in some cases. I think in Kansas, one estimate on the budgetary impact is that after the second year, Medicaid would cost this state at least $150 to $200 million annually in today's dollars. So that would mean, for every year with inflation, it goes up and up and up. One other, I think, influential piece of the Medicaid puzzle is the record number of illegal immigration we're having in the state. So the discussion item goes like this. The more and more undocumented or illegal immigrants that we bring into this country who would qualify for Medicaid or Medicaid expansion, it could tend to be a magnet for a state that has Medicaid. So until we see a slowing of the record level of immigration, over 6 million people in the last 2 years, the economic impact is certainly going to be that $150 to $200 million after a couple of years. That is the Medicaid piece.
Right.
And if we could solve those two,
sure.
If there was some way to contain the cost and make that sustainable, then I think further discussion is warranted.
Okay. On the medical marijuana, and we know that didn't go anywhere in this session.
Right.
Maybe the more interesting question to ask, you as a lawmaker, state lawmaker, you know that Oklahoma has medical marijuana. You know that Missouri has full-blown recreational medical, Colorado recreational medical. We're basically surrounded in our region by states that have some level of marijuana acceptance in terms of being able to access it as a resident of that state. Do you, and I don't know if you've been lobbied this way, or if other lawmakers have been lobbied this way in Topeka, but you look at what's going on in Missouri as far as the recreational, I don't know how anybody can afford it because everybody is getting their chunk of the tax revenue piece of that.
Right.
Every city seems to be, on the other side of the state line in Missouri, every city seems to be voting on and passing an additional 10%,
Right.
recreational marijuana tax that goes directly. So I guess the question is, are you lobbied, and do you look at it as, and I think they did this with sports gambling a little bit as well, it becomes an argument of revenues as well as the moral implications of this. We obviously passed sports gambling.
Yeah.
I think the revenue may not have started out, the revenue to the state may not have started out as beefy as they thought, but it's getting there now as people get more used to plugging it into their apps. Are you getting a similar lobbying effort, maybe even internally, about revenue-wise, the state would get more revenue if we brought marijuana on board?
Yeah, man, there's a lot to unpack in that question.
Sure, I understand.
But you really can't separate them completely, because if there's a progression, and I think first off there's an appetite to consider medical marijuana as long as it's dispensed appropriately, through a pharmacy or some other controlled mechanism. So that'd be one thing. The second part of that is, because a state has recreational marijuana does not mean you still don't have illicit or illegal marijuana.
Right.
due in part to some of the reasons that you
Yeah,
mentioned.
it's too expensive.
It's too expensive and it's
right,
taxed.
right.
And so some of the states that have done that, and even in Kansas, where I think law enforcement has indicated it's present in illegal marijuana being laced with fentanyl. So again, really those 2 or 3 issues. Medical marijuana, I don't, whether it was a hallway conversation, anecdotal, or in committee, there was no one that I talked to that just was adamantly opposed to consideration of medical marijuana. And again, it's with the right guardrails. So I think that would be the first of the 2 for consideration.
Sure.
The second one gets a little murkier, and it's when you consider recreational marijuana, the enticement for the revenue is certainly one thing. But again, I think we need to go into this with our eyes wide open in terms of other states that have decriminalized drugs, the unintended consequences of increased homelessness, psychotic episodes. The potency, excuse me, of recreational marijuana is not what was prevalent when I was a kid 40, 45 years ago. So those are the caveats and nuances. The marijuana lobbying industry is very active. I think before I was even elected, I was getting stuff in the mail from the marijuana lobby. Day one in the House, there were postcards on desks and in conference rooms from the marijuana lobby. So it's there. I don't want to paint Kansas as a state that is just totally backward. But in this case, and gambling is probably a good analogy. When the state thought they were going to get X revenue 2 years ago, and it actually turned out to be something less, is a little bit of a lesson learned. And if we're going to do it, let's do it right, and let's make sure that it's dispensed appropriately.
Right. Okay. All right. And you brought up fentanyl test strips as one of the issues that really, I think, towards the end, came on, and you explained that very eloquently. But are there any other issues, either local or statewide, that came up that that we certainly haven't talked about today? Maybe we didn't see it as often as others in other issues in newspapers and other media. Anything that you'd like to bring up that, hey, this was important, it didn't get the coverage that it deserved?
Yeah, I'm going to take a quick glance at my notes here, because there's a couple of things that have a local flair to them, and I don't want to forget these. Probably the one that I would start with, and then I'll try to end on a high note, is property tax.
Right.
When the property tax valuation notices went out in March, 2 things happened. Virtually every property owner that wanted to raise a stink could either email or call or leave message to whoever their legislator across the state. And so there was outrage. I think the average valuation went up 14-15%, and the same thing happened a year ago.
Right.
There was, as I mentioned in our tax bill, there was some property tax relief in the bill, but nothing that you would consider wholesale property tax relief. So I do believe that will, again, it was an emotional, and it's tied to to localities, the city of Lansing, to the county of Leavenworth.
Right.
Those municipalities, those governmental agencies derive and use a good chunk of money for their budgets from property tax. So we have to consider the impact on those government agencies. So I think that will come, and it will continue to be issued. Next year there is a Senate concurrent resolution to cap the rise of property tax valuation. It started out at 1%. I think it's at 4%. Will likely pass in both the House and the Senate, and then I think the path to success, it has to come through as a constitutional amendment. So that I believe that's one piece that's coming. I think it was my Fed and State or Health and Human Services Committee. University of St. Mary has an online Masters of Social Work program, and because of where they are in their credentialing process for that online degree, graduates, if a person graduated, they might not necessarily be able to go to work in their field immediately because of the lack of accreditation, if you will, for the program. So there's a timing piece. In one of the bills that we passed, I think it was Senate Bill 31. We fixed that. So graduates of St. Mary's, University of St. Mary's that have that Master's of Social Work degree can now practice in the field to which they've earned their degree. And then, and it may not seem like a high note to some, but it felt good to me. Had a young lady from Leavenworth email me in April, right before first adjournment. And she's a homeschooled student, and her name is Kathleen. And she said, hey, I'm a homeschooled student. I'm part of the junior Raider ROTC program. They've won national awards. She's in a very challenging homeschooled academic curriculum. Had tried out for the Leavenworth Pioneer girls soccer team. And I will quote her words in the email that she sent me. She said, after they found out I was a homeschool student, I was unceremoniously dropped from the team after I'd already done fundraisers, et cetera, et cetera. No fault for the school, no fault for the team, but it was the law, and she couldn't participate in those activities. So the good news for her is that in the bill the governor signed last week, there is a provision that homeschooled students can now participate in team sports, acacia sports, for the district in which they live. Doesn't mean she's guaranteed a spot.
Right.
You
got to make the team.
You got to make the team.
Right,
you got to pay the fees.
Right.
But Kathleen should have an opportunity to compete on the Pioneer soccer team next year.
Yeah, good, because I know there's my son-in-law was homeschooled in Missouri, and I believe he was able to play. Although the Christian leagues over there, at least where he was, were bigger. I'm not. Maybe I take that back. I'm not sure if Missouri, but that's good news because I know there are a lot of kids that are homeschooled.
Yeah.
They're pretty darn good athletes too.
Yeah.
You know that they should have the right to play.
Yeah, there's and you mentioned something that we tried to do in most instances is to look at Kansas. How do we stack up as a state relative to the other 49 in the union, the ones that are around us, whether it's tax, education, marijuana, Social Security benefits. We've got a lot of work to do to make Kansas a better state. The fact of the matter is that I think for 2 decades now we've been a net out-migration state, losing population, and that is something. This is a great state, great communities.
Sure.
We need to have tax and economic policies that keep people here that want to raise their families and continue to make the state it is.
Right.
So,
all right.
Yeah.
I've been speaking with State Representative Dave Buehler from Movers and Shakers. I'm Ken Miller.